in exchange for Israeli recognition, Palestinians can only now get incremental privileges that are afforded by the colonial power and its patron in response to perpetual subservience and proving that they are good natives, where there is zero potential for that to culminate in any form of meaningful self-determination. It's a trap. It's a trap. You can't win in that trap. There's no amount of recognition that you can get.
Welcome to the Opinion Euros podcast. The following is a conversation with Noura Erakat. Noura is a human rights attorney and an assistant professor at George Mason University. Her research interests include human rights law, humanitarian law, and refugee law. Her writings and public appearances have been published and widely featured on European American journals, as well as media platforms. In this episode, we have a thought-provoking conversation with Noura regarding the question of Palestine through the prism of international law. We discuss shifting paradigms, both in academia and the legal field, as well as questions of belonging, inclusivity, and the refugee crisis. Ultimately, this conversation is about potential for international law to be more inclusive and shaping a more inclusive future. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Please let us know what you think and who we should have next.
Welcome, Noura. We're delighted to have you here on Fresh Squeezed. So thanks for taking the time then to participate in the podcast. The first question I have for you is about your book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Rave reviews. We've read a number of the book reviews. They're all very positive. And what we noticed is that international legal scholars were especially impressed with what you did in terms of weaving the history of Palestine with the trajectory of international law, or what I would say European international law. So what we're wondering is whether this integration was intentional. Was that one of the objectives you had set for yourself when writing the book?
Thank you for those affirmations. I wish I could say that I had this brilliant idea. After a tremendous amount of study, I decided that I was going to write the book in a particular way, had an outline, and then set out to do it. But as many writers know, writing is a very iterative process. And often what you're looking for shows itself in the process of writing and then in the collaboration, because no project is ever single authored, but is always a product of collaboration and thinking out loud and grappling with ideas. So the short answer to your question is I absolutely did not know that it would look the way that it did. And what I did know is that I wanted to tell certain stories. How then do we get the chronological ordering and this weaving of history, as you say, the outcome of which provides a history of the present of the Palestinian struggle, as well as a theoretical intervention about the way that law works? For me, this comes from my own experience as a practitioner. I'm trained as a human rights attorney. I wanted to do that because I wanted to sue Israeli war criminals in U.S. federal courts. And the experience demonstrated to me how nearly impossible that was. Our first claims in 2005 were dismissed on grounds of non-justiciability. The victims and the survivors never even got to tell their story. Other venues that I entered where I was trying to pursue similar remedy were similarly foreclosed, whether it was at the UN treaty making bodies or in other tribunals. I found that whenever I thought law was going to help catapult us beyond the politics that impeded us in the institutions within which we existed, that in fact power and politics operated there too. So it planted a seed of inquiry for me. What is this relationship between law and power? And how does it help tell a story about the Palestinian struggle for liberation? And so that inquiry in itself was very vexing because the literature is broad. The literature tells us on the one hand that law is power, right? Which puts us both, aligns the realists as well as the critical legal scholars in a similar camp of saying, right, that the law may be very much a fiction. But on the other hand, in the other spectrum, we get told a story about the law operating much like a science, that it can be studied unto itself, which I definitely couldn't believe because of my own experience as a practitioner. And I refuse to believe the former because I'm an advocate, I'm an activist, and I have an infallible optimism. So I refuse to accept that former. And then in between, I found a number of other schools, like the constructivists, who tell us something about the relations between states, as well as scholars like Professor Duncan Kennedy, whose work on legal phenomenology was very enlightening, as were our many conversations that helped me land somewhere. And so once I had my own understanding about the relationship between law and power, I was able to weave together the rest of the story. Although, for full transparency, I wrote chapter 5 first, and then I think I wrote chapter 2, and then I wrote chapter 3 before I went to chapter 1. I mean, this wasn't even in order. So the fact that it ends up right in this chronological order with what looks like a seamless theoretical strand was vexing and iterative. It was about three full revised drafts, right, before I got there, to be able to tell the story in the particular way that I did.
So you
Sorry.
find yourself now, 4 years on. So 4 years on, and you're looking at this and saying now, did you achieve the goals you set out for yourself in relation to the book? Is this one of those times where you kind of look back and say, well, now that the book has simmered for a few years, I might have done the following differently, or moving forward, I'm going to do this differently to account for the book's reception?
So I'll tell you, and this is just for full transparency, especially for young scholars, I had very little expectations for the book. I was just worried it was, I and the book were going to be pummeled. Another book about Palestine. I mean, this is one, it's 100 years old. Everybody thinks they understand Palestine. Everybody, right? My inbox is full. I have a special folder of proposals I receive almost daily from laypersons who have the solution that we haven't thought of how to resolve this issue. So, it was very stressful. I thought to myself, maybe this shouldn't be my first book. So I had very low expectations. I was worried. I wasn't really thinking, what is this book going to do? I was just thinking, please just be okay. So I'll say that I was just happily pleased that it resonated with the two audiences I cared to read it. I really wanted this to be read by a lay audience that wanted to know about Palestine and how it is where we're at. I also wanted it to be read by experts on in the region as well as in the law to think about legal strategy moving forward. Now, some of my disappointment is the fact that I found, regardless of what I'm writing and the content of the book and the critical approach that I'm taking, I often get pegged as the doctrinal lawyer. People see Palestine law and, human rights attorney, and they want, they're leaning on me to provide a very doctrinal, response about the ICC bid, about the ICJ now bid, about different legal avenues and accountability. Most recently, the incursion, the onslaught of the Jenin refugee camp in July. And so, despite 4 years on and the content, I often have to say, listen, I never said that the law was going to help us. In fact, the argument I demonstrate is that international law has done more to advance Israel's interest than it has to advance Palestinian interests. So whatever faith we have in it is misplaced unless we understand that, to the extent that it can be beneficial to advance Palestinian liberation, it has to be advanced in the sophisticated service of political movement. And so we should do more to strengthen that political movement, to think about how to build power, and then think next, how do you use law as a tool in tandem with other tools? Where I end the book is actually, this is always setting up expectations. I often get asked what's the next, inquiry on law. How do you expand this? What's the next legal analysis? But because I have this approach about the law, where I end is actually trying to transcend these legal strictures and trying to transcend, not even that, but trying to transcend even nation state structures, to think beyond, to exercise drawing on Afrofuturism, right? And drawing on indigenous literature. I try to think about what is a Palestinian futurism. And so how can we think about alternative futures, not just what's possible right now? So I've ventured much more into thinking about race and racism in the international spectrum, in the law, beyond the law. And now I didn't intend this, but I'm working on a book project primarily for a lay audience, a broad audience, with Professor John Reynolds of Maynooth University, a fellow Twaler, where we're thinking about the recent human rights reports that find that Israel is an apartheid regime, in order to both critique the domestication of the concept of apartheid as a domestic project, eschewed of its colonial and global dimension, that both, that shapes the way that these human rights organizations find that Israel is an apartheid regime, where they basically tell us Israel becomes discriminatory in a way that absolves a colonial history and racial ideology that has led to this present. So that's the project we're working on now.
Noura, to go back to this idea of the fact that international law really hasn't served the Palestinian cause much, you opened the book with Resolution 2334, right? And it's supposed to be this monumental achievement because the U.S. abstained from using its veto power, and this is, it's a new development, and people hailed it as an achievement. We're what, 6, 7 years from it today. My question is, right, how do you feel about it today in retrospect? Has it achieved, or has it lived up to the expectations that we had for it? And most importantly, it seems as though scholars are now having a lot of mixed feelings about it. Some think it's actually been unhelpful, and some think it's actually been very counterproductive to the cause entirely. So how do you feel about this?
So that's a great question. In total honesty, at the time of passage of 2334, I also celebrated it as a victory, right, across social media, because it represented a moment of consensus, and at least in my mind at that moment, the US got out of the way as an obstacle, to the extent that this can now communicate, right? It had a discursive function that could have been leveraged. It had the latent political potential to be leveraged. And yet, and here this goes back to, my feeling, my analysis about the law on its own, it does nothing. It's another piece of paper. So insofar, obviously 2334 did nothing. The Israel is on the cusp of declaring de jure annexation of the entire West Bank. Forget settlements and settlement units. It's become, declared sovereignty over East Jerusalem, sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which isn't even contested. This is Syrian sovereign territory, right? Are transferred the administration of the West Bank from military governance to civilian governance. I mean, they've told us this is permanent. Even the fiction of temporality and military necessity have been lifted, right? So we not only have we gotten worse in settlements, it's gone far, it's advanced at record speed. The short answer to your question, I don't think it's been counterproductive. I think it's become, another piece of paper. I have a critique in the book that you see, that I think that the Palestinians, in order to garner the U.S. Abstention, had to make certain acknowledgments that they wouldn't confront Israel and that they remain within the U.S. and Israeli sphere of influence. Sure, but that's their MO. So it didn't make the situation worse. It just perpetuated a particular MO that they never moved out of.
This question is actually something that comes from my students, because my students are often confused about it. And they ask me, They say, Professor, is Palestine a state? Now, we studied the Palestine Declaration of Independence issued in 1988. Palestine enjoys the recognition of, I think it's either over or close to 140 countries around the world, which, in terms of population, represent the near aggregate of the world. Yet we also know that in 2014, Mahmoud Abbas put forward then a resolution that was ultimately vetoed then by the US, and it was a resolution then on Palestinian statehood. So over to you, Noura. Is Palestine a state? Which indirectly, I suppose I'm asking, do you subscribe to a declaratory theory of statehood, recognition, or something else?
It's a great question. I think I'm going to answer just rhetorically. Let's say that I subscribe to this declaratory recognition of statehood, in which case Palestine is obviously a state, right? So what? So what? Right? This is a moment where the idea of statehood has to not only be recognized by those who, are recognizing it, right? By those who are declaring it and then certain recognition, but what consequences does it have, right? Is there territorial integrity? Is there sovereignty? Is there ability to control the economy? Is there a control of borders? Is there an ability to have a standing army? Is there an ability to control nationality and citizenship? So all of these things that are quite consequential. Can you control the airspace? Can you control the population registry? Can you control the aquifers, right? The underwater resources? Can you control any adjacent bodies of water, right? All of these practical questions that emerge, none of those are part of our theoretical understanding of what a state is. The outlines of you have to have borders, there's going to be recognition, there's a concentrated population with a shared history, and so on and so forth. And so instead of having a state, regardless of what theory you subscribe to, we're in a sovereignty trap. Palestinians are in a sovereignty trap, as are many indigenous peoples, right? The cost of, and this was articulated very clearly by the Palestinian leadership during the negotiations that culminate in Oslo, or the 1993 Declaration of Principles, that for them, for a colonized people, that the greatest form of success would be to earn the formal recognition of the colonial power, right? That's stated very explicitly by Ahmed Iqrar, who was one of the three negotiators who led to the ultimate agreement, the back channel agreement in Oslo. Very clear, desire and goal. That's what they get. But in recognition, in exchange for Israeli recognition, Palestinians can only now get incremental privileges that are afforded by the colonial power and its patron in response to perpetual subservience and proving that they are good natives, where there is zero potential for that to culminate in any form of meaningful self-determination. It's a trap. It's a trap. You can't win in that trap. There's no amount of recognition that you can get.
So there's a sovereignty trap. And so while these traps are all taking place simultaneously, any idea of achieving anything that resembles a positive outcome, a two-state solution, or whatever you might like to call it, is actively corroded, and you paint this picture very well in the book, by the increasing encroachments by Israeli settlements, the land grabs, the population transfers, all of that. How are you supposed to envisage any solution from here on out, right? So, I mean, when you look at the debate, the scholarly debate, it seems as though nobody considers a two-state solution anymore. The one-state solution is slowly revived at times. Do you consider that as a possible outcome at all?
I actually have been saying, since the collapse, the formal collapse of the peace process after, the Camp David talks fell apart in 2000. We recognize many Palestinian analysts and activists recognized then that the two-state solution was formally dead. Not only, in the words of Edward Said, that it was born dead letter and is a flawed project, which it was. And I demonstrate this in the book as well, right? I think it's so obvious that if you read the actual legal documents, that you only have to be literate to understand. You don't have to have legal expertise to understand that there was never a Palestinian state promised. It was never going to lead to statehood. It was a promise. It was an autonomy project, right?
Right.
And, thousands. We have empirical evidence that demonstrates everything that they told us in that first 7 years, right? We see that there was no incremental transfer of authority. We see 100% increase in the number of settlements under a labor government, not even the Likud, or now what we have an even more far right, but under a labor government. We see that the most that they were willing to offer at the Camp David talks was what analysts described to us as, a series of Bantustans. There is no two-state solution. The best possibility of it had been tried. An excessive amount of faith had been placed in it, where there was empirical data and legal stipulations that should have been in place with anything that should have been a peace agreement, right? And now we have 7 years of empirical evidence, the collapse of the talks. It's the end of the two-state project. The fact. And I said then, right? Even then I said, to those who described the one state solution as, fancy and, what is this? This is an activist dream. It's not practical. But even then I had said the two state solution is no more fanciful, or no less fanciful, excuse me, than the one state solution. Both are incredibly difficult to implement. Both would require a radical political shift. Both would require a tremendous amount of resistance and political power, right? Both would be difficult to implement. We had that proven in the two-state solution. And when people want to think about the one state is more difficult than the two state, frankly, they're not thinking hard enough. They're thinking as very simply, if I have a piece of pie and I want to share it, we think about dividing it, right? But when you cannot divide the pie, you have to think about eating it together. Partition is not a solution here. Partition has been proposed since 1936 in the partition plan, again in 1947 as a result of the UN Special Committee on Palestine, again in 1988 with full Palestinian acquiescence. The Israeli leadership from left to right, the entire spectrum, told us that they would never partition the land and there will never be a Palestinian state. Ehud Barak was the one exceptional Israeli leader who acknowledged that there could be a Palestinian state and then proposed this truncated state that looked like the 1968 Yigal Allon plan that divides the West Bank into two parts with a perimeter connecting Tel Aviv that flows through Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. We've been told there will never be partition, and it doesn't work. Rather than trying to compete over who is sovereign on the land, we should shift, which is a mutually exclusive equation. I suggest shifting to a mutually inclusive equation of who can belong there. Because belonging has infinite potential. Belonging has infinite potential. And yet, the primary obstacle to the project of belonging is not Palestinians. It has not been Palestinians, but in fact, are Zionist settler sovereigns who believe that this is their divine right to have jurisdiction on this land, sovereignty on this land, from the river to the sea, who believe it is divine right to be supreme as racial and religious and national class, and the rest of the world, rather than object to this, right, rather than hold Israel to account, instead cowers because of a failure, right, a failure and an inability to confront anti-Semitism in its modern forms, so that the Israeli project is not equated with it. And that's where we're stuck. We're not stuck on a solution for Palestine, right? We're stuck on how to address anti-Semitism, because the future of Palestine is rather clear. There's a native population that has been removed and replaced and is at threat of complete annihilation, according to this government explicitly, right? They should belong. Refugees must return. There should be repatriation, right? This is about the restoration of some form of indigenous sovereignty and recognition. Is it Jewish Zionists, I should say, who believe that they belong to this land are quite strange to me, who rather than understand what it means to belong to Palestine based on the indigenous population, the native population who have been there, right, are trying to create a satellite European state instead. And so again, I think that this takes us back to thinking, I think there has to be a lot more courage of what folks do about anti-Semitism. Israel is not the solution. A Zionist settler sovereignty in Palestine is not the solution. It's a failure. It's a failed model. It's what we should not support, and it's what we should not export or replicate.
So I want to pick up on a word that you used in this last answer. You used the word belonging. I'm really curious about that word, and I'm curious about that word because of this shift that we've seen in debate surrounding international law. Because of the work of Twale, because of the work of a number of critical legal scholars, we've now seen at least even some mainstream international legal scholars begin to acknowledge the biases that are built into the regime. And they're responding in kind. So European Society of International Law held a conference on, not on belonging, but on inclusivity. Agile, at least Agile Unbound, ran a special issue on race. You published in that along with John and Daryl. And so what we're starting to see are certain efforts by, we might say, white scholars, we might say historically white supremacist scholars, by these white learned societies. We're seeing these efforts at being more inclusive. And do you see these efforts as indicative of a type of an awakening? Or is this what Malcolm X might term a reckoning? So the chickens are coming home to roost. Those scholars who were made peripheral are now in a kind of open confrontation with that mainstream core.
I want to say I agree with you, Mohsen, because I think I'm hearing you say the latter, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that the moment that we're in, where we see this shift to inclusivity and belonging, UNHCR also has used the framework of "I belong" and that mantra as well. This moment is wrought by crises, global crises. We have, refugeedom was thought to be an exceptional state, but it's now becoming quite pervasive. The Middle East is home to the largest refugee population. Iraqi refugees, Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, Yemeni refugees, Sudani refugees, right? That this is the primary condition. It's not the exceptional condition. Well, if we think about refugeedom, right, as no longer being exceptional, but quite possibly becoming more of a norm, we're in a moment at a major crossroads. We're actually at this crossroads. You're articulating this crossroads where we have to rethink now what? Now what? In terms of the nation state and these borders that are created. If initially the nation state was envisioned by many, right, anti-colonial revolutionary leaders as a form of emancipation and leadership, it was to protect from a form of domination, right? But in this particular moment, the nation state instead is used as a way to protect and enshrine a particular amount of privilege. Most of these refugees that are fleeing climate doom and warfare and instability are trying to seek access to Europe, to the United States, to Canada, and so on and so forth. These former colonial powers have acquired most of their wealth through the theft of land and labor, right? And peoplehood altogether. I mean, saying that slavery is not a theft of labor. Slavery is a theft of people, right? And so there's a tremendous amount of wealth there that has not been redistributed. And in fact, these industrialized countries are the primary, sources of climate harm. because of their advanced stage of development, right? There is actually reparations that are needed here. So the crossroads that we're at, are we going to face that history where there's meaningful reparations, not only included in just forgiving of debt, right? Forgiving of debt, in an investment, right? An investment in the former colonized peoples, right? And the reparations in the form of open borders, right? Or what we're seeing with a lot of these fascist supremacist movement, which is a closing of those borders, right? Actually making them more rigid. And not only making the borders rigid, but then being righteous about the ability to be supreme, to have that privilege as a matter of right, and to exercise that as a form of sovereignty. That's a very dangerous future. I see Israel on that trajectory. I see white supremacists who want to emulate Israel. Richard Spencer had said that he sees Israel offering, after the nation state law was legislated in 2018, Spencer remarked that Israel is offering a model for the future of European sovereignty. Right? I see it in Hungary very explicitly. We see it in a Modi-led India, right? We're seeing it in a number of places. We see it in the threat of the ascendance of a far fascist right. That is the future they want to place us on. And so how do we respond to that moment? I mean, obviously I've said my piece, but I also said that I also think that if we're thinking beyond this, it's very helpful to think that the nation state is not, is basically an invention. We created it. It's about 200 years old. We can organize ourselves in other ways, and probably have better, we have to adjust to these times and have better prospects of survival. Again, that requires vision, risk, openness. And I think that we see that we see it in the work of a lot of civil society, but not yet led by any particular state.
So let me pick up on that word risk. And I'm bringing this up because of your own work as a scholar of international law. Now, you've been appointed at various American universities, and your research focuses on Palestine. As you've mentioned, it focuses on racial justice, solidarity, those topics then for which, at least within American legal academia, or even legal academia more broadly, have been kind of frowned upon, if you will, within those circles. So what we're wondering is the situation in the US, and so in US legal academia, is that changing because of the work of scholars like you, like yourself, like Tendai Achiume, James Gathi, Asli Bala, and so on? Or right, are you still peripheral? Is this then again more of two conversations taking place, as at least Tendai has suggested as well?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think two things can be true. I think change is quite the norm. In the words of Octavia Butler, in Parable of the Sower, change is the only thing that's constant, that stays the same. Change is the only thing that stays the same. So obviously, there is a tremendous amount of change and shift within the legal academy. We see that, just in the uptake of how we deal with race and racism as a serious topic, not only as a matter of study and knowledge production, but even in management, right? Even in the way of hiring, even in the way of pedagogy, how we teach the classroom. And that's a result of uprising. That was the result of Black uprisings. This wasn't people sitting around a room who read a lot of books on racism and had an enlightened moment, right? Oh, racism sucks. We need to do something about it. This was wrought by uprising, right? And and similarly, other changes on the question of Palestine have been similarly wrought by protest and disruption, not by acquiescence. There's a movement that's shifting the grounds that we stand on, that makes someone like me legible within the academy. But again, two things can be true: that all this change is real and happening, and we're still these twale, the critical scholars, the critical race theorists, the critical feminists, and so on and so forth, are still on the periphery of what remains a very mainstream doctrinal approach to these matters. Two things can be true, but because we take up more space, it means that we have a broader and larger student audience who also take up more space. So it becomes planting the seeds and promise of what we do moving forward. And we're going to see, it's one thing to be tolerated as a minority voice. It's another thing when the minority voice becomes, exercises a threatening amount of power. So it's, so let me just be really explicit here. Like, think about when Obama becomes president. It was one thing to think about equality for Black people, but the idea was equality for Black people in a country that was, where white supremacy was not questioned. So you can be as equal to whiteness. This is the height of your aspiration. But the idea of taking power and possibly shifting what that ceiling looks like, that becomes a threat to a base. And quite oddly, because Obama didn't necessarily mean to threaten any of it, right? It was more of an identity politics. I think he pursued more of the same. In the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, the questioning of, was there ever a first Black president? And so here again, I think that once we get to that moment, Mohsen and Ahmad, once we get to that moment where those of us who are on the periphery, who are now taking up more space, are actually taking up, are about to take up a threatening amount of power on a platform, we're going to see a lot of those who might think this is great and tolerate it become part of an opposition because we've gone too far. I mean, I'm being very blunt, but I don't think it's particular to the academy, and I don't think it's particular to the government, and I don't think it's particular to civil society or institutions. I think this is power. And any group that's in power is not going to happily relinquish it. And so thinking about what it means then to be an ally. We're not necessarily competing for power as we're trying to change the conditions under which we exist. So it's not competing for domination. It's actually struggling to create other conditions that afford us better optimal futures.
Noura, let's end where we began. And this is a question that builds upon something that you mentioned at the very outset. You spoke of Afrofuturism. And so what I'm wondering then is, what is your freedom dream for Palestinians and for Palestine? And it's a two-part question. And of course, being the international legal scholar that I am, I have to ask, is there a role for international law in advancing this freedom dream you have for Palestinians?
I love this question. Thank you. My freedom dream for Palestinians is a freedom dream for all people, which is to be able to live without fear and with infinite possibility, that all your possibilities are available and not bound by, geographic determinism, right? Or status determinism, where you were born, how you were born, right? This is freedom, that we can live without fear and with infinite potential, each of us. And so that's a vision that not only requires us to get past settler decolonization, which is a requisite element in this process, but also to get to, financial structures of and economies of how people live. That also gets us to addressing social ills and the future of gender freedom. And so it's a composite. It's not merely limited to the politics that define Palestinian life. What is the role, if any, for international law? I think the role is to use it as a tool to the extent that it can help us get there. That's what it is. And that we create new rules. And so what is law if not, the legitimacy that we offer it? We comply with it because we believe it offers us a good. Right? There's a voluntary compliance. Otherwise, if it's completely coercive, it's illegitimate and it's tenuous. Apartheid. right? Jim Crow, it's not going to last. It can't last. And so what is it? How do we use law as a tool, and how do we create investment in it when it serves us in a voluntary form? That's all up to us. It remains contingent.
Thank you very much, Noura.
Thank you.